The comprehensive biography of John Adams. Architect of American independence, early life, and education. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735, in Braintree, now Quincy, Massachusetts. The son of a modest farmer and shoemaker, Adams was raised in the rugged, egalitarian society of New England. His early years were spent exploring the outdoors, hunting, and fishing, despite his father's insistence on the importance of a formal education. Adams initially attended a dame school before proceeding to a local Latin school, which prepared him for higher education. Showing immense intellectual promise, Adams entered Harvard College at the age of 15 in 1751. During his time at Harvard, Adams was exposed to the Enlightenment ideals of the era, broadening his intellectual horizons beyond his provincial upbringing. He studied a rigorous curriculum that included logic, ethics, philosophy, and rhetoric, graduating in 1755. Although his father had envisioned a career for him in the clergy, Adams resisted the idea, finding the strict doctrines of the church unappealing. Instead, he briefly taught school in Worcester, Massachusetts, to earn the tuition fees necessary to study law. In Worcester, he was heavily influenced by local attorney James Putnam, who ignited Adams's passion for the legal profession. Adams studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1758. He returned to Braintree and quickly established a reputation for his formidable intellect, integrity, and analytical acumen. In 1764, Adams married Abigail Smith, a highly intelligent and strong-willed woman who would become his lifelong confidant, closest advisor, and intellectual equal. Over their 50-year partnership, the Adamses forged a remarkable bond, navigating the turbulent waters of the American Revolution and raising 4 children, including John Quincy Adams, who would later become the 6th U.S. president. Explore their extraordinary partnership through Abigail and John by Edith Bell Gels. The road to revolution. Adams's ascent to prominence coincided with Great Britain's tightening control over the American colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, imposing taxes on printed materials in the colonies. Adams emerged as a central figure in the Massachusetts political scene, vigorously opposing the act as a tool of oppression and an infringement on colonial rights. He penned eloquent essays, including the dissertation on the canon and feudal law, which argued that the fight for liberty was fundamentally a defense of intellectual and political freedom. Despite his vehement opposition to British policies, Adams possessed a deep commitment to the rule of law and the principle of a fair trial. This commitment was severely tested in 1770 following the Boston Massacre, an event in which British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists. The soldiers were charged with murder, and Adams, at great risk to his personal safety and professional reputation, agreed to serve as their defense attorney. He successfully argued that the soldiers had been provoked and acted in self-defense, resulting in the acquittal of most of the men. This principled stance, though temporarily unpopular, cemented his reputation as a courageous lawyer dedicated to justice above popular sentiment. By the early 1770s, Adams was a leading voice for the patriot cause. In 1774, he was chosen as a delegate to the First Continental Congress and subsequently the Second Continental Congress, representing Massachusetts. In Congress, Adams quickly emerged as a fierce advocate for independence. He realized that for the colonies to successfully unite against Great Britain, they needed a military leader from the South to build a truly continental coalition. Thus, in June 1775, he nominated George Washington of Virginia to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Declaring independence and diplomatic service in the spring of 1776, Adams drafted a preamble to a resolution that effectively called for the colonies to sever all ties with the British Crown. On July 2, 1776, Congress formally voted in favor of his resolution for independence. He then served on the committee responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence. Although Adams was a far more experienced and prominent writer than Thomas Jefferson, he deferred to Jefferson to write the document, recognizing Jefferson's exceptional literary flair. Upon the adoption of the Declaration, Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, famously predicting that July 4th would be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival and commemorated with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. During the latter part of the Revolutionary War, Adams transitioned from a legislative leader to a diplomat. In late 1777, Congress appointed him as a commissioner to France. Accompanied by his young son John Quincy, Adams embarked on a perilous voyage across the Atlantic in the frigate Boston. Over the next several years, he worked tirelessly to secure vital loans and diplomatic recognition from European powers. Adams faced significant challenges in France due to the strong personalities and differing visions of his fellow diplomats, particularly Benjamin Franklin. Recognizing the need for a fresh approach, Adams traveled to the Netherlands in 1780. Through persistent diplomacy, he secured diplomatic recognition from the Dutch Republic in 1782 and negotiated a substantial loan of 5 million Dutch guilders. This funding was critical to the survival and eventual victory of the American military forces. In 1783, Adams, along with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. The treaty recognized the United States as an independent and sovereign nation and secured highly favorable territorial boundaries. Shortly thereafter, in 1785, Adams became the first United States minister to Great Britain, where he had the delicate task of representing the new republic to the very king against whom the colonies had rebelled. The vice presidency, after nearly a decade in Europe, Adams returned to the United States in 1788. In 1789, the first national elections were held under the newly ratified U.S. Constitution. George Washington was unanimously elected president, and John Adams, having received the second highest number of electoral votes, became the nation's first vice president. For a man of Adams's intellect, vigor, and ambition, the vice presidency proved to be a frustrating and largely insignificant role. Because the Constitution gave the vice president very little power, aside from presiding over the Senate, Adams found himself sidelined from major executive decisions. He famously described the office to his wife as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Despite his frustrations, Adams served 2 terms as vice president, playing a steadying role in the formative years of the Republic. He frequently cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate, mostly in support of Washington's policies, thereby helping to establish the authority and structure of the executive branch. The presidency, when George Washington declined to seek a 3rd term in 1796, John Adams was the natural choice for the Federalist Party. In the first contested presidential election in U.S. history, Adams narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson, who, under the rules of the time, became his vice president. Adams inherited a nation deeply divided, both politically and ideologically. The country was polarized by the French Revolution, with the Federalist Party favoring closer ties to Great Britain, while the opposition Democratic-Republican Party sympathized with France. The defining challenge of Adams's presidency was navigating the escalating tensions with France. Outraged by the Jay Treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain, France began seizing American merchant ships. Seeking a diplomatic solution, Adams dispatched a 3-man peace commission to Paris in 1797. However, the French foreign minister demanded massive bribes before negotiations could begin, a diplomatic scandal known as the XYZ Affair. The XYZ Affair outraged the American public, leading to widespread calls for war. Responding to the crisis, Adams oversaw a major military expansion, including the establishment of the Department of the Navy, earning him the title Father of the American Navy. He also authorized the creation of a provisional army and ordered American naval vessels to attack French ships that were harassing American commerce. This undeclared naval conflict became known as the Quasi-War. Despite intense pressure from within his own party, most notably from his former ally Alexander Hamilton, Adams resisted the demand to declare full-scale war. He recognized that a major war would financially ruin the young nation and could tear the country apart. In 1799, Adams took the bold political risk of sending a second peace delegation to France. This move successfully led to the Convention of 1800, which ended the Quasi-War and restored peaceful relations. Adams later regarded avoiding an all-out war with France as his greatest presidential achievement. However, the Quasi-War crisis also led to one of the darkest periods of his administration. In 1798, a fearful Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws, which Adams signed, made it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens and heavily restricted freedom of speech and the press, specifically targeting journalists and politicians who criticized the government. The acts were widely viewed as unconstitutional and a violation of the First Amendment. The resulting public backlash severely damaged Adams's popularity and the reputation of the Federalist Party. Learn more about this constitutional crisis via the Miller Center's John Adams Presidency overview. The election of 1800 and retirement. The presidential election of 1800 was one of the most bitter and acrimonious in American history. The country was sharply divided over the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Federalist Party itself was fractured. Adams faced a formidable opponent in Thomas Jefferson, his own vice president. The campaign was characterized by vicious personal attacks, with Federalists accusing Jefferson of being a radical atheist and Democratic Republicans painting Adams as a tyrant who wanted to establish a monarchy. Ultimately, the election resulted in a victory for Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. The transition of power marked a critical milestone in American history, the first time a ruling political party peacefully surrendered power to the opposition. Although Adams was deeply disappointed by his defeat, he accepted the results and left the White House in March 1801, retiring from public life. He was the first president to occupy the White House, having moved into the unfinished executive mansion in late 1800. Following his presidency, Adams retreated to his family estate, Peacefield, in Quincy, Massachusetts. His retirement years were marked by a return to private life, reading, writing, and managing his farm. For a time, the bitterness of the election of 1800 created a rift between Adams and his former friend, Thomas Jefferson. However, beginning in 1812, the two former presidents reconciled and began a remarkable correspondence. Over the next 14 years, they exchanged hundreds of letters, discussing politics, philosophy, religion, and their shared experiences during the Revolution. This famous correspondence stands as one of the greatest literary and philosophical treasures in American history. Legacy and death. John Adams lived to a remarkably old age, outliving many of his contemporaries. His passing occurred on one of the most symbolic dates in American history, July 4th, 1826. It was the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Remarkably, Thomas Jefferson had died just a few hours earlier at Monticello. Adams's last words are famously recorded as, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was 90 years old. Today, John Adams's legacy as a founding father and the second U.S. president remains profound. While his presidency was marked by fierce political division and controversial laws, his visionary diplomacy, his philosophical writings on government, and his tireless advocacy for American independence are now widely celebrated. He was a man of immense intellect, uncompromising principle, and unflinching honesty, whose contributions laid the foundational pillars of the United States. His story, from the Boston Massacre to the highest office in the land, is beautifully chronicled in David McCullough's epic biography, available on Amazon.